The secret of the sands. The glaring brightness of the Egyptian desert sands almost blinded the travelers riding in the caravan. Among the group were two Oxford University students, B.P. Grenfell and A.S. Hunt. Only 3 hours more and we should reach the edge of the Fayum. Grenfell turned to Hunt, who was riding beside him. I wonder what we shall find this year. Hunt guided his camel so that he might ride closer to his companion. God has been good to us in our search. I'm sure that before this year is past, the Fayum will yield more of its secrets to us. One of the group of tourists who was riding with them pressed forward. Sirs, you have been here before. We understand. Tell us, what is that stately group of palms beyond the stretch of sand, and that blue lake beside it? Is that the Fayum you've been telling us we shall see by nightfall? Grenfell and Hunt smiled at the eager tourist. That is only a mirage. It is many miles yet before we reach the oasis at the Fayum. Impossible, the man was indignant. You're not even looking where I point. The palms and the water are very plain. Another tourist interrupted. Sirs, we know that we are new to the desert, but this is no mirage. The water shimmers in the sun. You are making sport of our ignorance. We know how you feel toward this, said Grenfell kindly. They are very plain to the eye, the trees and the water. But wait. When we come to the top of the rise ahead of you, you will have a better view. The caravan moved on as the camel drivers urged their complaining animals along the sandy road. At the crest of the hill, they stopped while the animals rested. The party looked out across the desert to where the palm trees had stood and where the enchanting blue lake had seemed to be. But now there was nothing but a stretch of blinding sand. It is unbelievable, said a tourist, but it is so. Since you know this country, tell me, sirs, what brings you again to the Egyptian desert? Once is enough for me in this hot, forsaken land, another tourist spoke, shielding his eyes from the glare. We are searching for pappyrus, ancient writings which have been buried in these sands for centuries. Grenfell gestured toward the vast expanse of desert. People lived here in towns 2,000 years ago. During the centuries, they have moved away, and the sands have blown in to cover the towns. But everything of value would have decayed and crumbled to dust long ago, the tourist urged. Ordinarily, yes, Hunt agreed, but these dry sands often sifted into the houses and covered everything with a layer that protects and preserves. This dry desert air keeps away decay. Last year, in a tomb we opened, we found some flowers that were more than 2,000 years old. They still retained their color. The fragile papyrus, whether found sealed in tombs or buried in the sand, is not decayed. What are these pappyrus that you mentioned? A woman in the group asked. Pappyrus is a kind of paper made by the ancient Egyptians. All along the Nile River and out through the Delta region grew a tall reed, something like our bulrushes back home. The Egyptians used these reeds for many things, boat making, fuel, and even for paper. They took the pith from the inside of the stems and rolled it flat. A layer was laid down and then another placed across it. The two layers were glued together and the surface was rubbed smooth. Do you mean to say that this fragile paper keeps for 1,000 years and that it's worth hunting for? Doubt was written on the face of the tourist. You must ride on, Grenfell said as he gave the signal to the camel drivers. But when we reach the edge of the great Fayum, I shall point out to you the ancient buried towns and villages. A woman guided her camel near Grenfell. Tell me, sir, she said quietly, do you find parts of the Bible written on these papyri? The New Testament books were written in Greek within the 1st century after the resurrection of Christ, Grenfell answered. These first books were probably written on papyrus in ink. All these autographs, as the original manuscripts were called, have been lost. What a shame. But they were copied before they were lost. Copied many times, in fact. Some copies were even brought to Egypt by the early Christians. And have you found these copies of the scriptures? Since we have worked here in the Great Fayyum Oasis for 5 years, we have taken back to England hundreds of pounds of papyri. In the winter we excavate here, and the rest of the year, when the weather is too hot for work in the desert, we sort over the papyri we have found, searching for something of value. And you have found the scriptures? She insisted. Yes, we have found portions of the scripture. We have found fragments of the Gospels and some pages from the writings of St. Paul. Everything that we find, whether it be biblical manuscripts or writings of that day, throws light on the New Testament. God bless you in your work, sir, the woman answered. His hand is over his precious word, and I am sure that he will guide you to the buried treasures. In late afternoon, the travelers saw before them the great oasis of Fayyum. It was a deep depression in the desert. Palm trees grew in clumps here and there, and a lake lay on the far side. Now, is this real? A tourist questioned, pressing forward, or is this another mirage? This is real, Grenfell said with a smile. This great Fayyum covers more than 600 square miles. At one time it was a fertile, prosperous section of Egypt. A great irrigation canal crossed from the Nile, and towns bordered the lake. A king built a magnificent palace and a winter resort beside the lake. Then what happened? Through the centuries, the canal was abandoned. The towns were deserted, and in time the sands covered them, except in the swampy region on the far side of the valley. Where do you work here in this valley? Another tourist questioned. We began in 1896 over there at the site of the old town of Oxyrhynchus, where you see those ruins in the mounds of sand. But this year we plan to excavate at the site of the ancient town of Tebtunis on the southern edge of the Fayyum. Grenfell pointed across the oasis. Grenfell and Hunt left the caravan and made their way along the sandy road to the floor of the oasis. They found Arab workmen who knew them from previous years, and in a few days they were excavating the little town of Tebtunis. The rubbish heaps by the ancient ruins usually yielded papyri, for the ancient people had thrown the waste paper outside the town on the refuge dumps where the sands buried it. But at Tebtunis the workmen found very little. At last they found a cemetery. It held nothing but mummified sacred crocodiles, which had been worshipped by the inhabitants of the town. Day after day nothing appeared but more crocodile mummies. One day, an Arab discovered an unopened tomb. He worked long digging away at the sand, but when the tomb was opened, he found it empty except for one baby crocodile mummy. The workman picked up the crocodile in anger and threw it against a rock and broke it in pieces. Grenfell, who stood nearby, gave a shout of astonishment, for out of the broken mummy fell pages of papyri. What they had been searching for lay hidden in the crocodiles. The other mummies were broken open, and the searchers found that most of them were stuffed with well-preserved manuscripts. Some of the mummified creatures had rolls of papyrus in their mouths, and others were wrapped in long strips of papyrus covered with linen. In this strange manner, these valuable papyri had been preserved for 1,700 years. When the season was over, Grenfell and Hunt returned to London with many boxes of pappyrus manuscripts. Some pages were complete, while others were torn or burned until only a fragment remained, but each was carefully put away for future reading and cataloging. Years of work would be necessary to identify and catalog the papyri. As the scholars labored, they found many kinds of material. Recipes a housewife had copied, letters from children to parents, work contracts, legal documents, and verses from the Holy Scriptures. Every sheet of papyrus was filed according to its message. The papyri were also divided according to the date when they were written. Because of events in history mentioned in them, the scholars were able to place the time when they were written. Since the style of writing and the way of forming certain letters changed through the centuries, these points helped the men to decide when the papyri were written. In 1931, a young scholar, C.H. Roberts, came to the John Rylands Library, Manchester, England, to help catalog. He was as eager to decipher the papyri as Count Constantine Tischendorf had been to read the parchments. Because of his success in reading ancient Greek, Roberts was chosen by the trustees of the library to catalog the hundreds of sheets and fragments that Grenfell and Hunt had brought from Egypt. One day Roberts was sorting through a pile of fragments that were broken and mixed with dust. He picked up a scrap, dusted it carefully, and laid it between pieces of glass. With his magnifying glass, he looked searchingly at every letter. There were no complete lines, only words and letters, but as he read, he recognized the familiar words. "Can it be?" he whispered. "These words are from the Bible." He adjusted the lamp and examined the fragments more closely. "To this end was born, and for this cause." Roberts pieced the words together and turned excitedly to his Greek Bible. He found the verses of which these words were part in the 18th chapter of Gospel of John. But the writing on the fragment was a more ancient style than that on the others that he had been studying. He felt growing excitement as he compared this with the other fragments. As the young man checked this fragment, which was less than 3 inches wide and only slightly longer, he realized that it was older than any he had ever found before. For years, some scholars thought that John, the beloved apostle, was not the author of the 4th gospel. They thought that this gospel had been written by an unknown author about 200 years after the death of Christ. But the style of writing and other reliable tests show that this fragment of the book of John was written only a little over 100 years after Christ lived. It proved that John could easily have written the book that bears his name. One day, as Roberts was again examining the fragment, a small boy, the librarian's son, slipped into the room. Roberts held out his hand. "Come, George, you may look." George had often visited Roberts, and he always watched carefully, but never disturbed the precious papyri. The boy gazed at the torn fragment that lay between the 2 pieces of clear glass. "What's the little scrap?" he asked. "Does it tell something important?" Roberts laid down his magnifying glass and answered, "What it says is not so important, for we have the same verses much easier to read in our Bibles. But this scrap is very old. It has been hidden away over 1,800 years." Roberts frowned a little, as though hunting for a way to explain to the child the value of the fragment. You remember that John was a beloved disciple who was a close friend of Jesus. John was a young man when he walked and talked with Jesus, but he lived to be 100 years old, some people say. He wrote the book of John when he was an old man. The boy leaned forward and looked again at the fragment. Did he write this? No, probably not on this scrap of paper. But someone copied what John wrote. Perhaps he sent the verses in a letter to a friend in Egypt, or he might have traveled on a boat himself and taken his copy with him. All we know is that this scrap of the book of John was in Egypt for centuries, and now we have it in England. It makes us feel very near to John and to Jesus.